Lock onto target. Disrupt it, Varnak Thrisk ordered, his voice sharp, commanding the attention of the entire command center. His claws hovered over the tactical interface, quickly confirming the coordinates for Solferry 918, a Terran supply ship that had strayed too far into restricted space. The operation was routine, no surprises, just another job to maintain order in the Veil's vast domain. Targeting, Overseer, Palarn replied, his voice steady, as his eyes flicked to the laser plasma displays. He manipulated the controls, calibrating the railgun. The sleek image of the ship appeared on the viewport, and the system hummed to life, powered by unyielding efficiency. Coordinates locked, velocity steady, no evasive maneuvers, target is unarmed, Palarn continued, confirming the situation with calm precision. Varnak's gaze remained cold, focused. He had seen countless operations like this, routine eliminations of minor threats, their systems maintained under the cold, bureaucratic hands of the Veil. The system of power, built over centuries, was flawless, infallible. This was just another cog in that great machine. Proceed, Varnak commanded, the word coming without hesitation. The procedure was clear. Eliminate the threat, erase the violation. Palarn nodded once and tapped the final command. The railgun hummed, and the shot was launched. The space outside the station was dark, cold, and vast. But as the kinetic railgun fired, a pinpoint of light appeared in the emptiness. In an instant, the shot would reach the target and neutralize the ship in a flash of destruction. But what Varnak saw on the screen was something far beyond his expectation. A quiet moment passed. The light on the display blinked in an odd sequence. Then the target was gone. Not shattered, not even burning. The ship had simply vanished, leaving only a faint trace of heat and vaporized debris behind, like it had never existed at all. What in the star? Varnak muttered, stepping closer to the main display, his expression unreadable. He clenched his fists, staring at the void. There was no explosion, no debris. The ship had simply folded, collapsing in on itself like it had been swallowed by the very fabric of space. Status! His voice was calm, but his pulse quickened, and he knew that something had gone wrong. Palarn's eyes darted across his screens, confirming the data. Target, it's gone. No fragments, no heat signatures, no trace of it left. Varnak's mind raced. This wasn't possible. The procedure had been flawless. The railgun had been calibrated for precise destruction. Why had the ship vanished like that? Analyze or run, he demanded. Gorich Yun, a technician in the far corner, glanced at his console. His face grew tight with confusion. I'm running diagnostics, Overseer. The data doesn't match any known pattern. His fingers danced over the console, furiously typing commands. There's no evidence of any destruction, nothing. It's as if it simply stopped existing. Varnak's brow furrowed as he stepped toward Gorich's station. What are you saying? Are we experiencing a malfunction? No, Gorich said, slowly shaking his head. It's not a malfunction. The ship didn't break apart. It's not even in the system anymore. There's no energy release, no radiation bloom. It's just gone. The room fell into a tense silence. Officers exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. The normally smooth operations of the Veil Command Center had been disrupted, and no one knew why. Varnak stood still, his eyes locked on the empty space on the laser plasma display where the Solferry 918 had once been. His mind churned through possible explanations. This was no ordinary malfunction. This was something else. Recheck the coordinates, Varnak ordered, his voice tight. Run a full diagnostic. I want to know where that ship went. Gorich hesitated, uncertainty creeping into his movements, but he obeyed. His fingers moved quickly over the console, calling up system logs. His eyes widened as he scrolled through the data. Coordinates are confirmed, Overseer. The ship was in the correct position. The trajectory was stable. There's no error in the system. But his voice trailed off as he stared at the console in disbelief. What's wrong? Varnak asked, his tone hardening. He could sense the tension in the room mounting. Something wasn't right, and he needed answers. Gorich swallowed, his eyes flicking to the main display. It's not just the ship. Whole systems are disappearing from our map. Entire sectors, gone. They're not even registering in the databanks. It's like they've been erased. Varnak's pulse quickened as he processed the words. The implications were staggering. What do you mean, erased? I can't explain it, Overseer. The systems are gone, vanished from the galactic map. It's like they never existed. Varnak's mind raced. The Veil had never encountered anything like this. They ruled the galaxy with an iron grip. Their control over space and systems absolute. And now it seemed that grip was slipping. What's the cause? Varnak demanded, his voice still steady, though the pressure was beginning to mount. Gorik's fingers hovered over the console, typing furiously. I'm not sure, Overseer, but I'm seeing an unusual pattern in the readings. Some kind of disturbance. Something is rewriting the data. Before Varnak could respond, Pilarn's voice interrupted. Overseer, we have another anomaly. 3 massive ships just entered Veil space. They're dreadnoughts, Varnak said, finishing Pilarn's sentence. His heart sank as the massive silhouettes of the ships appeared on the display, their immense size casting shadows across the stars. Confirmed, Pilarn continued, his voice laced with apprehension. 3 dreadnoughts moving slowly. Their energy signatures are unusual. They're not engaging. They're just blocking. Varnak turned to face the viewport, his mind racing. The dreadnoughts loomed in the cold depths of space like silent. Gorik, check the diagnostic logs again, Varnak ordered, his voice steady but sharp, his eyes still focused on the screens that lined the command center. The disappearance of Soul Fairy 918 still weighed on his mind, but now the problem had deepened. The irregularities weren't just isolated to the ship. Something far more complex was unraveling. Gorich Yun's fingers moved quickly over the controls, his eyes scanning the data streaming across his laser plasma displays. The normally stable flow of information was now a patchwork of fragmented readings and corrupted signals. As he typed, a sharp buzz sounded from his console and his screen flickered. He quickly reinitiated the sequence, but the glitch persisted, growing worse with every pass. Diagnostics are clear, Overseer, Gorich said, his voice growing tense. The ship is gone, no trace. But this isn't just a ship, sir. I'm seeing a displacement in the grid. Varnak's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. Displacement? What are you talking about? It's like sectors, entire systems are fading from our map. Gorich's eyes locked on the data streams, his gaze frenzied now. Not just erased, they're unreachable. These systems, they're not appearing on any relays. There's no trace. It's like they've simply ceased to exist. Varnak's mind raced as he processed the words. A part of him was reluctant to believe it, but the data on the screen didn't lie. Systems, star systems that had always been there, parts of the Veil's galactic order, were no longer accessible. It was as though space itself was being rewritten, and with every new scan, the edges of the galaxy seemed to shrink further. Gorich, Varnak pressed, his voice now tinged with urgency. You're sure this isn't a fault in the system? A glitch? I'm sure, Gorich replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I've never seen anything like this before. The room grew colder, the hum of the station louder in its emptiness. It wasn't the usual calm hum of a working machine, but something more ominous, a prelude to something far more unsettling. Varnak's gaze moved across the room, catching the looks of unease from the officers at their stations. The calm had evaporated, replaced by confusion and mounting suspicion. They all sensed it now, the creeping feeling that they were on the verge of something they couldn't understand. Can we trace the missing systems? Varnak demanded, though he knew the answer. Gorich didn't respond immediately. He was already running a new series of commands, his fingers flying over the console. A few moments later, he spoke again, this time with a strained voice. No, Overseer, the systems aren't just inaccessible. They're gone. The routes have been altered, replaced with data I don't recognize. It's as if the star systems have been overwritten, like they never existed. Varnak's eyes narrowed, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. This wasn't just an anomaly. It was the start of something far more dangerous. But who could be responsible? And how? The technology to alter galactic data was beyond anything the Veil had encountered. Yet here they were, facing something that defied the most fundamental principles of their empire. "Send a report to the council," Varnak ordered, his voice hardening. "This cannot be ignored." Pilarn, the targeting officer, glanced at his superior. His face, normally calm, now reflected the same uncertainty that lingered in the air. "Varnak, the dreadnoughts. They've moved into position. They haven't fired, but they're blocking our fleet. I don't know how." Varnak snapped his gaze to the viewport. The dreadnoughts, massive and silent, stood against the stars like shadows cast upon the universe itself. Their forms were as imposing as they were inscrutable. They hadn't fired a single shot, yet their presence alone was enough to halt the Veil's operations. It wasn't an invasion, it was a blockade. "They are manipulating the flow of space itself," Varnak murmured, more to himself than anyone else. He turned sharply to the officers behind him. "Prepare for an emergency transmission. I want the fleet ready. We don't know what we're facing." "Sir," Gorik said, his voice quivering slightly, "there's more. I've been trying to identify the source of the interference, but something's wrong. I'm detecting shifts in the gravitational fields around the ships. It's subtle, but it's there. The dreadnoughts aren't just in space, they're distorting it." The words hung in the air like an electric charge. Gravitational shifts. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. Varnak's eyes flicked between the officers, the growing sense of unease taking root deep within him. This wasn't just a military operation. This was something else. Something far more sophisticated and terrifying than anything the Veil had ever encountered. The dreadnoughts weren't here to destroy. They were here to control. "Sir, incoming message from the central relay," Pilarn called out, his voice trembling with the realization of the situation. "Put it through," Varnak barked, his mind already moving through scenarios of what could be happening. The display flickered for a moment before an image filled the screen. It was a message from one of the higher officers of the Veil. Their face was grim, the lines of their face drawn tight with the burden of the news they were delivering. "Varnak," the officer's voice was strained, "we've lost communication with several outer sectors. There's a pattern forming, a strange kind of interference. And..." They paused, their gaze heavy with what they had seen. "The stars are shifting, not just the sectors. Entire regions of space have realigned." Varnak felt his stomach tighten. He looked over at Gorik, who was already running another round of diagnostics, his face pale. "I know," Varnak said, his voice low and cold. "I can see it." "Do we have a plan?" Gorik asked, his hands shaking as he continued typing. Varnak's mind raced through the possibilities. Earth had done something far beyond the capability of the Veil. The enemy had manipulated the very space the Veil had once considered theirs. They were outsmarted. They were trapped. "No plan yet," Varnak replied, his eyes locked on the slowly disappearing sectors on the map. "But we need to figure out how to get it back." The cold realization began to sink in, but it was not the kind of defeat one might expect. No, this wasn't defeat. This was something worse. A complete shift in the rules of engagement. The dreadnoughts had shown them something far worse than military power. They had shown the Veil that they could control not just space, but the very essence of their galaxy. And as the fleet scrambled to prepare, Varnak knew they were about to face the most terrifying battle of all, one where the battlefield itself had been rewritten. "3 dreadnoughts, Overseer." Moving into Veil space, Pilarn's voice cut through the tense air, breaking the silence that had lingered since Gorik's last report. The command center had turned into a chamber of growing uncertainty, the atmosphere thick with unease. Varnak Thrick stood motionless in front of the viewport, his eyes scanning the data scrolling across the heads-up display. But he already knew what Pilarn was about to say. He turned slowly, his gaze cold and sharp. "What are their intentions?" Pilarn's eyes were glued to his console. "No signs of aggression, no weapons activation. They're not even sending out a signal. They're just there." "Where exactly?" Varnak asked, though the answer was already apparent. He had seen the colossal shapes on the plasma screens before. The dreadnoughts, massive, immovable, impervious to anything they had ever encountered. They weren't here to fight. They were here to assert their control. "They've settled in the core sectors, blocking all major trade lanes and entry points. It's like the entire region is frozen, Pelarn continued, his voice laced with growing disbelief. There's no activity, no attempts at communication, just presence. It's as if space itself is holding its breath. Varnak's jaw tightened. He looked down at the data, watching the sectors go dark as the dreadnoughts silently moved into position. He could feel the weight of their presence pressing in, even through the cold, unflinching walls of the command center. These ships weren't just vessels, they were symbols. Their stillness wasn't passive, it was a declaration. The Veil was no longer in control. The universe had shifted, and the first sign of that shift had arrived in the form of these unyielding shadows. "Track their movements," Varnak ordered, his voice steady but thick with a cold undercurrent. "We need to know how to counter this." "Their position hasn't changed," Pelarn reported, his voice flat. "They are stationary, but their size. Overseer, these ships, they dwarf our entire fleet. There's no strategy to engage them. They're too large, too stable." Varnak narrowed his eyes, his mind calculating. No engagement, no attack. Just the dreadnoughts sitting there, blocking the lanes. No matter what actions they took, they couldn't move forward. They were trapped. The fear of a direct assault was unnecessary when the dreadnoughts had already sealed the fate of their fleet. "They have no intention of fighting," Varnak murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "They want us to realize something." At that moment, Gorychun looked up from his station, his face pale. "Overseer, I've found something. It's unsettling. I'm seeing gravitational fluctuations across the region. The dreadnoughts. Each one is distorting the fabric of space around them. It's not a traditional gravitational field. It's different." Varnak turned toward Gorich, his interest piqued. "Explain." "There's no signature from the dreadnoughts, no usual signs of energy being expended. But the data suggests they are warping the space around them," Gorich continued, his voice faltering with disbelief. "It's almost as if the very structure of the galaxy is shifting, bending to their will. This isn't conventional warfare. It's something else." Varnak's eyes snapped back to the viewport. He could feel it now, the subtle shift in the air, the quiet pressure building around them. The dreadnoughts weren't just blocking the stars, they were manipulating them. This wasn't a fight. This wasn't a war. This was a display of control, of power beyond anything the Veil had prepared for. "This is not just a blockade," Varnak said slowly, his voice low with realization. "They are rewriting the laws of engagement." As if in answer, the dreadnoughts seemed to loom larger on the display, their dark forms casting an ominous shadow over the command center. Their stillness was not passive, it was deliberate, it was complete, it was a reminder. The Veil, for all their might, were no longer the rulers of this space. Gorich swallowed hard. "The fleet's movements, they've been completely restricted. We can't engage. We can't move. The dreadnoughts are blocking everything." Pelarn's voice broke in, sounding strained. "We've lost control of the trade lanes. We've lost control of our systems. It's like they've severed the arteries of our empire." Varnak turned back to the viewport, staring at the dreadnoughts as they sat motionless in the stars. This was not a confrontation. This was not an attack. This was a quiet, unyielding demonstration of power. They were not here to battle the Veil. They were here to force the galaxy to kneel. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of their realization hung in the air like an invisible chain, binding them to a truth they were unwilling to face. "They don't need to fight us," Varnak muttered, his words cold and final. "They've already won." He turned sharply to Pelarn, his expression hardening. "Prepare the fleet for the next phase. We need to understand what's happening. The dreadnoughts can't control everything. Not if we move swiftly." Pelarn nodded, though his face betrayed the doubt that lingered in his mind. How could they possibly outmaneuver such a force? How could anyone? "We'll need more than just tactics, Overseer," Gorich said quietly. "We'll need a miracle." Varnak's gaze remained fixed on the dreadnoughts, the massive ships now blocking the stars, their presence immutable. He took a slow, measured breath. "Miracles don't win wars. Strategy does." The words felt hollow even as he said them, knowing that for all their power, Their strategy was now nothing but a smattering of hope against the silent behemoths that loomed in their galaxy. He knew it wasn't just their military strength that had been tested. It was their understanding of the galaxy itself. How could they ever fight an enemy who didn't need to fire a single shot? "Activate all sensors," Ziltark barked, his voice sharp, slicing through the tension that had settled in the command center like a fog. His amber eyes locked on the laser plasma displays, the cold glow reflecting his growing frustration. "Track the dreadnoughts. We need answers." The officers at their stations scrambled into action, their movements quick but deliberate. Each display flickered with data streams, yet no matter how many times they refreshed, no answers came. The vast, immovable ships continued to drift across veil space, silent and unyielding, blocking the stars in a way that no force should have been able to. "We've attempted multiple communications," Palarin reported, his voice strained as his hands hovered over his console. "No response, no signals returned, no attempt at communication. They don't acknowledge us." Ziltharik's jaw tightened, his claws digging into the edge of the console. "Run the tactical analysis again. We've underestimated them before. Do not make that mistake again." "Sir, the readings, they're inconsistent," Gorichun said, his voice barely audible, but heavy with unease. He tapped his console, his fingers hesitating over the keys. "The dreadnoughts, nothing about them fits our previous understanding of fleet behavior. There are no energy spikes, no transmissions, no targeting coordinates. They aren't responding to anything we've tried." Zilthark turned slowly, the cold realization beginning to creep into his mind. "Explain." "It's not just that they're silent, sir," Gorik continued, his gaze flickering nervously towards Zilthark. "There's a distortion, an interference, as if the space around them is bending. We can't lock onto their signatures. They don't exist in the way a ship should." The words hit Zilthark like a physical blow, but his expression remained unchanged. He had been the fleet marshal for longer than he cared to count, and this was beyond anything he had ever experienced. The idea that the very fabric of space was warping around these ships, it was unthinkable. "We're being outmatched," Zilthark murmured, more to himself than to his officers. "They've turned our own systems against us. They're blocking us, not with weapons, but with presence." "The dreadnoughts are too large to engage," Palarin said, his voice growing heavier with each word. "Even if we were to take them head-on, we'd be crushed before we even make contact. And yet they do nothing. They simply exist. They are unmovable." Gorik's hands flew over his console once more. "It's not just that they're unresponsive. The gravitational distortions around them are complex. Every sector they occupy, every piece of space they occupy, there's a ripple effect. I can see it. We can't send out signals to those regions, and any ships we try to send are being redirected. We're locked out. It's as though they've rewritten the map itself." Zilthark stood rigid, his sharp mind racing to keep up with the escalating situation. "And the fleet?" he demanded. "What are they doing?" "They're waiting," Gorik said, his voice dropping as the weight of the realization settled in. "They've blocked us completely. We can't move forward. We can't retreat. All routes are cut off. They've sealed the galactic pathways." Zilthark exhaled sharply through his mandibles, his anger and confusion rising, but it was quickly replaced by something more dangerous: uncertainty. "This is not a standard engagement. This is not a blockade. They are controlling space itself. We are irrelevant." He turned to his officers. "Prepare the fleet for analysis. I want every ship, every available resource to focus on understanding these ships. We can't act blindly." Palarin nodded, though his hesitation was visible in the stiff set of his shoulders. "And when we find nothing?" he asked, a question left unspoken but hanging heavily in the room. Zilthark turned back to the viewport, his gaze fixed on the three dreadnoughts. "Then we rethink everything we know about warfare. These aren't enemies in the traditional sense. They're altering the battlefield, rewriting the rules we thought were sacred." The tension in the command center thickened, as if the air itself was becoming heavier with each passing moment. The officers continued to work, but there was an underlying sense of defeat now. No enemy had ever made them feel so small, so insignificant. "Report," Zilthark ordered, his tone cutting through the growing frustration. He needed information, something concrete to act on. Another officer, Ryloth, spoke up, his voice shaky. "The dreadnoughts. They're not just blocking space. They're influencing the galaxy's gravitational network. I'm seeing irregular shifts across sectors. Systems we relied on for navigation are being realigned. Not attacked, but altered." Zilthark's claws flexed, and his eyes narrowed. "Are you saying they are tampering with the very structure of the galaxy?" "Yes, sir," Ryloth confirmed, his voice barely a whisper. "It's as if the galaxies themselves are being restructured, one sector at a time. Our own systems are becoming incompatible." Zilthark's fists clenched. This wasn't just an assault on their fleet. This was an assault on the very idea of control. The Veil had built their empire on a system of order, of predictability. But now their very existence was being rewritten before their eyes. "Get the fleet commanders on the line," Zilthark commanded. "We'll need to form a new strategy. We've lost all control over our territory. This is not a matter of power. It's a matter of presence. We're not facing an army. We're facing something far worse." The room was quiet except for the soft tapping of keys and the distant hum of the systems. But that silence felt different now. It was a silence of realization, of helplessness. Zilthark could feel the weight of it pressing in on him. The Veil's mighty fleets were now impotent in the face of something they could not understand. "Prepare the fleet for an unknown war," Zilthark murmured, his voice low and grim. "We are no longer fighting for territory. We are fighting for relevance." As the officers scrambled to carry out his orders, Zilthark stood still, his gaze locked on the screens in front of him. He had led countless battles, and yet, here they were, facing something that could not be fought with weapons, tactics, or strategy. The dreadnoughts were not here to conquer. They were here to unmake. They were rewriting the very structure of existence, and there was nothing the Veil could do to stop them. The first crack in their empire had been made. "Gorich, report!" Zilthark's voice came through the tension-laden air, sharp as a strike of lightning. His eyes were fixed on the laser plasma displays, though the answers he sought were nowhere to be found. Every attempt to reach the Veil's galactic sectors had been met with failure. The dreadnoughts continued to stand like colossal shadows, blocking the flow of space, while the galaxy itself seemed to warp under their silent control. Something was wrong, and the Veil's fleet could not ignore it any longer. "Sir, I've checked the coordinates again. The systems, they're not responding. We're losing entire sectors from the galactic map," Gareth Yun replied, his voice strained. He looked up from his console, his face pale, eyes wide with confusion. "It's like they're not there anymore, like they've vanished." Zilthark's claws gripped the edge of his command table, his mind racing. "What are you saying? Explain it." "I'm not sure," Gorich muttered, tapping at the console again in a futile attempt to reconcile the data. "I've never seen anything like this. Whole star systems, once critical to our trade routes, to our control, they're just gone, erased from the charts. I've never encountered such inconsistency." Zilthark leaned forward, his gaze icy but filled with a growing sense of dread. "Erased?" he echoed, his voice a low growl. "Erased how?" Gorich's fingers trembled as he ran through the diagnostics, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "It's like the sectors never existed. Their data points have vanished from our maps as if space itself is rewriting the coordinates. The systems aren't just inactive, they're gone. No interference, no distortions, just empty space." The cold, impersonal glow of the laser plasma displays illuminated the room, casting long shadows across the officers who watched in silence. The usual hum of activity in the command center felt absent, replaced by the eerie stillness that had followed the dreadnought's arrival. The Veil had always commanded the galaxy through sheer strength, and now the dominance felt fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. Zilthark's mind raced. He had fought in countless campaigns, seen entire fleets decimated, but never had he encountered an enemy like this. The power of the dreadnoughts was not in their weapons, but in their ability to control the very fabric of space itself. And now it seemed the Terrans were taking their manipulation even further, erasing sectors from existence. But why? Sir, Gorik said, his voice strained, it's not just the systems. The data, everything we've built our empire on, is collapsing. I've run all the scans. They're showing distortions in gravitational fields, warping space itself. It's as if the fabric of reality is changing around us. Zilthark's chest tightened. He turned slowly, looking at his officers, his eyes flicking between each one, watching their faces reflect a growing panic. The Veil's greatest strength had always been their control over the galaxy's infrastructure, and now that very control was slipping away. The dreadnoughts weren't just physical objects. They were forces that could alter the very laws that governed existence. Tell me this is a glitch. Zilthark's voice was sharp, but the fear behind it was clear. I can't, Gorik replied, his voice almost a whisper. This is real. I've been monitoring the gravitational distortions. We're losing whole sectors. The gravitational fields are being reset. Systems we've used for centuries to navigate are now inaccessible. Zilthark stared at the map, now covered in patches of darkness, empty spaces where entire systems once thrived. We have no maps, he muttered under his breath. We have no control. Palarn, who had been silent until now, spoke up from his station, his voice low but filled with urgency. Sir, what are we supposed to do? If they've changed the structure of the galaxy itself, how can we even fight them? Zilthark clenched his fists. We're not fighting a fleet, Palarn. We're fighting the very framework that holds the galaxy together. These dreadnoughts, they aren't just ships. They're the architects of a new reality. The words hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. There was no more illusion of control. The Veil had ruled with strength, yes, but that strength had been tied to their understanding of how space, power, and gravity functioned. Now the Terrans had demonstrated that they could rewrite those rules with the flick of a switch. We need to regain our position, Zilthark said, his voice hardening with determination. We need to understand how they're doing this and find a way to stop it. His officers worked quickly, but their movements were mechanical, devoid of the urgency they once carried. Every attempt to re-establish the galactic map was met with failure. The systems, once familiar, were now ghostly, mere remnants of what they had been. The Veil had never encountered anything like this. No war, no strategy could have prepared them for an enemy that wasn't interested in fighting. They were interested in erasure. Zilthark's claws dug into the console as he stared at the blank spaces on the map. We've been outmaneuvered, he said, his voice steady but filled with a cold realization. The Terrans are not just winning, they are changing the very rules of engagement. The command center fell into a tense silence as the officers continued their work, but the effort felt futile. The weight of their realization was settling in. There was no way to fight this. The Terrans were not interested in conquering systems. They were erasing them, rewriting space itself. Zilthark exhaled sharply, a bitter taste rising in his throat. We cannot fight what we cannot see. Prepare the fleet. I want every available resource to focus on analyzing this topological shift. We need to understand the Terran strategy. If they are rewriting the stars, we need to know how. The officers nodded, but the desperation in their eyes was impossible to ignore. This was not just a military threat. This was a total redefinition of power. The galaxy was no longer theirs to control, and the real horror was realizing that, in this new universe, they may never be able to find their way back. The lights in the command center flickered, casting long shadows as Zilthark stared at the empty spaces where whole sectors once existed. The vastness of space had always been their domain, but now it felt suffocating. This was no longer a battlefield. It was a void, an empty, shifting void that they had no hope of conquering. We've lost, Zilthark said quietly, but firmly. And now we must find a way to survive. Fire the anti-grav disruptors. Zilthark's voice echoed sharply through the command center, each word laced with the frantic urgency building within him. He paced in front of the display panels, his claws clattering against the metal floor as his mind raced. The dreadnoughts hadn't moved, still as imposing as ever, their presence an immovable force against the Veil's fleet. We've tried that already, Palarn responded, his tone tense. It doesn't work. They're unaffected. Every attempt to destabilize their position is being nullified. Zilthark's eyes narrowed, the growing panic in his chest tight with each passing second. He turned to face his officers, the weight of his gaze pressing down on them. "Then what do we do?" he demanded. "These ships are not moving. We cannot afford to sit here while they control everything." "I've rechecked the weapon parameters, sir," Gorat Yun said from his console, his voice strained. "None of our conventional countermeasures are having any effect. Their presence alone is warping space around them. We can't even get a clear shot." Zilthark slammed his fist into the console, frustration boiling over. "So we're powerless?" His voice was low, almost venomous. His own disbelief echoed through the cold chamber. The Veil had always held power through control. Control over space, control over systems. But this was something they couldn't fight. They had no weapon for this. "What if we try a more focused pulse?" Palarn suggested, though his words were hesitant, as though he feared the suggestion would reveal how helpless they truly were. A concentrated burst of energy, aimed directly at their cores. It might shake them loose. "Try it," Zilthark snapped, his claws flexing, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and helplessness. Every time they attempted to gain control, the dreadnoughts remained unfazed. Their stillness only served to amplify the growing terror. The more they tried to fight, the more it seemed like they were being buried under the weight of an impossible force. The command center's hum intensified as Palarn initiated the sequence. The sound of keyboards clicking rapidly filled the room, the laser plasma displays flickering under the pressure of the commands. The pulse shot out, a beam of energy designed to destabilize the dreadnought's position. But when it reached its target, the ship didn't even shudder. There was no ripple, no movement. The pulse simply dissipated in the vast emptiness, as if it had never existed. "Nothing," Palarn reported, his voice a whisper of disbelief. "No response. They're not even acknowledging the attack." Zilthark stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the massive ships now occupying their space, their shadows stretching across the star systems. These were not vessels. They were anomalies. Terran ships, but not like any they had ever faced before. The silence that followed was deafening. The dreadnoughts hadn't moved, and neither had the Veil. In all their years of conquest, they had never faced an enemy like this. An enemy that didn't even need to fight to win. They were being swallowed whole by the very fabric of space, their once infallible control slipping away. "Sir," Gorak's voice cut through the tension, "I'm seeing something else." His eyes were glued to his display, a frown spreading across his face. "I'm tracking a series of spatial fluctuations. The systems, their entire structure, they're shifting. It's subtle, but it's happening. The stars are realigning." Zilthark took a step forward, his breath coming in shallow bursts. "What do you mean by realigning?" he asked, his voice barely more than a rasp. "It's as if the maps, the sectors, they're being restructured, like the entire galaxy is being redrawn," Gorak said, his voice trembling slightly. "I can see the shifts, but they don't make sense. The boundaries, zones that should be intact, are suddenly gone." The room froze. Zilthark's chest tightened. The maps, the control, they had relied on the galactic layout for eons. It was their foundation. But if that foundation was being torn apart— "We've lost the sectors," Zilthark muttered, his claws digging into the console. "The galaxy is changing before our eyes, and we can't stop it." His mind raced, but the more he thought, the more it became apparent. This wasn't a battle they could fight. No strategy, no weapon would win against this kind of manipulation. The dreadnoughts weren't just blocking their path, they were altering the very foundation of space, forcing the Veil to watch helplessly as everything they had built crumbled. "What is this?" Palarn asked, his voice hoarse with the weight of the growing terror. "How do we fight something that can bend reality like this?" Zilthark's gaze was fixed on the empty sectors flashing across the screen. There were no answers. Just the stark realization that the Veil's might was no longer enough to stand against the power of the Terrans. "We can't fight them," Zilthark said flatly, the words like a death knell. "This isn't a war. This is a transformation. The Terrans are rewriting the stars." The officers in the command center stood motionless, their hands hovering over their consoles, unsure how to respond. Zilthar could feel the weight of their helplessness settling on his shoulders. They had been outsmarted, not through sheer firepower, but through a quiet manipulation of the very space they occupied. They had thought the Veil was unbeatable. They had thought their strategies would last forever. But in a matter of hours, humanity had shown them how fragile their power truly was. "Prepare the fleet for a full retreat," Ziltharic ordered, his voice cold, betraying none of the terror that was gnawing at him. "There's nothing left for us here. The galaxy has already moved on." As the officers moved quickly to carry out his orders, Zilthark stood still, his thoughts churning. He had led them through countless victories, but nothing had prepared him for this. The Dreadnoughts were not here to fight. They were here to end an era ruled by the Veil. And now, it was over. "The sectors are gone, Zilthark." Gorkyun's voice was shaky, an undercurrent of disbelief threading through his words. The room was still, save for the faint hum of systems trying and failing to bring order back. The Veil fleet had been rendered helpless, powerless in the face of an enemy that didn't need to fight. "They vanished, sir. The Terrans, they've done something. I can't even process it." Zilthark stared at the laser plasma displays, his sharp gaze cutting through the distorted images of the galactic map. Whole sectors, entire star systems, were missing. The borders that had once held the Empire together were now empty voids. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. The heart of the galaxy had been torn out, and in its place there was only an unbearable stillness. "We've lost entire sectors, Overseer," Pelarn added, his voice laced with the same disbelief. "No explosions, no battles, just empty space. It's as if the galaxy itself has rejected them." The words didn't make sense. Zilthark had seen the Veil's power, felt the vastness of their reach. They had ruled the stars with precision, with dominance. But now, facing the silent, unyielding blockade of the Dreadnoughts, the truth was undeniable. They were no longer in control. "Where did they go?" Zilthark asked, though the question seemed pointless the moment it left his lips. His mind fought against the reality that was unfolding before him. "The systems aren't just inaccessible, Overseer," Gorick continued, his hands shaking as he tapped at the console. "The galactic map is changing. The sectors we relied on, their coordinates, they're gone. It's not just that we can't access them, it's as if they've been erased, like they never existed." The words hung in the air, heavy with an almost unnatural finality. Zilthark's chest tightened. The Veil had never faced an enemy like this. Their entire structure, their empire, was built upon the assumption of predictable space, of mapped routes, of knowing where their enemies were and where they could strike. But now that knowledge had dissolved. "Run the diagnostics again," Zilthark barked, his voice strained with urgency. He couldn't accept it. Not yet. "Do it manually. We must have missed something." But even as Gorick ran another series of checks, Zilthark knew the truth. They had missed nothing. The systems were not malfunctioning. The galaxy itself was being altered. Gorick's voice trembled as he looked up, his face pale. "I've never seen anything like this before. It's as if the laws of space are being rewritten. It's impossible." Pelarn's eyes darted between the displays, but his focus kept returning to the Dreadnoughts, still floating unmoving in Veil space. "And what if we try to engage them?" he asked, his words betraying his fear. "Their presence is changing everything. What if we try to break through their blockade? Will we be able to—" "No," Zilthark interrupted, his tone flat, resigned. "We've tried everything. They don't move. They don't react. It's not a matter of firepower or tactics anymore. We're being manipulated on a level we don't even understand. They're not here to fight. They're here to change everything." The air in the command center felt thick, suffocating. It wasn't a silence per se, but it was a stillness so profound that it felt like the galaxy itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, a realization, a conclusion. But no one could say what that would be. The Dreadnoughts continued to float, their massive forms unmoving, their presence pressing down on the very space around them. The Veil's systems, which once pulsed with energy, now felt vacant, empty. Zilthark had been in control of vast stretches of space, but here, now before the dreadnoughts, he was just as lost as everyone else, a fragment of a shattered map. "Send word to the council," Zilthark finally said, his voice thick with frustration. "We must inform them. They have to know what we're dealing with. We can't continue blindly." "We've tried," Gorik replied. "They aren't responding. No one is." Zilthark's hands clenched into fists, his claws digging into his palms. "Then what do we do?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "How do we fight this? How do we even begin to understand it?" There was no answer. Not from his officers, not from the trembling data streams. No answer came from the galaxy either. Only the cold, unfeeling stillness of the dreadnoughts. The enemy was not attacking. The enemy was not fighting. The enemy was simply present. The force was here, unmoving, unyielding, and with every passing moment, the Veil was being reminded of just how small their once mighty empire had become. The eerie stillness of the situation gnawed at Zilthark's thoughts. The Veil's military might, their strategic superiority, had always been their foundation. But what good was power when space itself was being bent to the will of another? When the very rules that had defined their empire were being rewritten by a force they could not even touch? "The systems are gone," Gorik said again, his voice barely more than a whisper now. "I can't. There's nothing I can do. We've lost control." Zilthark's gaze swept the room, his officers motionless at their consoles, their faces etched with the same fear that tightened his chest. The dreadnoughts were still out there. They weren't advancing. They weren't retreating. They were simply holding space, suspended in a vacuum of their own making. Zilthark's mind raced, his thoughts tangling with the enormity of it all. The galaxy, their galaxy, was slipping through their fingers, and all they could do was watch. "Send another message," Zilthark ordered. His voice was quiet now, heavy with the weight of their failure. "Send it to every corner of the Veil. Let them know what's happening." "Sir?" Palarn said, hesitating. "What message?" "The only one we can," Zilthark replied, his voice low as the realization began to settle in. "Tell them, the galaxy is no longer ours." And as the command center hummed with frantic activity once more, Zilthark looked out toward the dreadnoughts, his heart heavy with the terrible truth. The Veil had been conquered, not by force, but by something far worse. A presence so complete, so total, that there was no fighting it. There was only the inevitable. "Overseer," Palarn's voice broke through the quiet hum of the command center, pulling Varnak's gaze away from the laser plasma displays. His officers were scattered about, their movements robotic, their eyes dull as they stared into the flickering maps. In the stillness of the room, it was impossible to ignore the cold weight that pressed against them. "It's happening, sir. The sectors, they're vanishing." Varnak's expression hardened, but inside a cold panic began to build. He had been waiting for the words. He had been avoiding them, but now they were out, spilling into the air like a cruel revelation. He stood motionless for a moment, unable to pull his eyes from the screens. The galaxy they once knew was slipping away from them, piece by piece. Whole sectors that had been under Veil control for centuries were no longer visible. The borders, once carefully etched and established, were fading into nothingness. The dreadnoughts remained where they had always been, still unyielding and utterly without explanation. "We can't ignore this anymore," Palarn added, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "The maps, they're changing. The systems, the stars, everything is reconfiguring itself. This isn't just about control anymore. This is something deeper, something we don't even understand." Zilthark stood off to the side, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "What do you want me to say, Palarn?" His voice was heavy with exhaustion, the words dragging out from deep within him. "This is not a war. It's a desecration. They are not fighting us. They are erasing us. And we can't do a damn thing about it." A quiet settled over the room. The realization that they were no longer in control hung thick in the air, suffocating every officer in the room. Zilthark turned to face the viewport, his sharp eyes trained on the dreadnoughts. They were still. They were everywhere, blocking paths, sealing off the galaxy. But they didn't need to move. They were waiting. "They're rewriting the galaxy," Zilthark murmured, as though the words were as real to him now as the cold walls of the command center. And we can't even fight back. What we've built, what we thought we controlled, it's all slipping away. Varnick's thoughts began to race, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. His mind clung to the shattered fragments of understanding. He had known something was wrong, but now it was clear. The dreadnoughts, these strange, silent behemoths, weren't just about controlling space. They were reshaping it, pulling the very foundation from under their feet. "We've been so sure of our power," Varnick said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "For centuries we've ruled, we've conquered. But this," he shook his head slowly, "we're not being conquered, we're being erased." The room fell even quieter if that was possible. There were no battles, no explosions, no physical damage. The galaxy simply shifted, and the veil was left in the wake, floundering in the emptiness. Varnick had led them for so long, but now as the weight of the realization hit him, he felt as if he were adrift in an endless void. "We're obsolete," Zilthark finally said, his voice harsh and bitter. "The Terrans have turned everything we know on its head. They've not just destroyed our fleet or our infrastructure. They've rewritten the very rules we thought we controlled." "It's not just about victory," Pilarn said quietly, his eyes haunted. "This isn't just a battle. It's a quiet execution. It's as if they're deciding where we exist and where we don't." Varnick's gaze lingered on the dreadnoughts, their shadows casting long over the Veil's fleet. The stillness of space was broken only by the quiet click of keys and the shifting of data across the plasma screens. But the absence of sound, of action, was far more terrifying than any weapon. "These ships," Varnock said, "they don't need to fight us. They don't need to do anything. They are not here to conquer. They are here to unmake, to turn everything we've built into dust." The harsh realization settled heavily on their shoulders. The Veil was not under attack. They were not being beaten in battle. They were being erased, their very presence in the galaxy being swept away like footprints in the sand. There was no defense against this, no strategy, no countermeasure. Just the slow, inevitable retreat into nothingness. "How do we fight an enemy that doesn't fight?" Gory's voice was a low whisper, as though the question itself was an act of disbelief. "We can't," Zilthark said quietly. "We don't fight them. We fight for the right to exist." Varnick stepped forward, his mind struggling to keep up with the vast, growing sense of helplessness. He couldn't fathom it, couldn't accept it, but the truth was undeniable. They weren't at war. They weren't even being defeated. The Terrans had done something far worse. They had quietly removed the Veil from the equation. They had made the Veil irrelevant. "Prepare the fleet," Varnock said finally, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "We may not be able to fight them, but we can still act. We can still resist. This is not the end. It's only the beginning of something far worse." As his officers scrambled to obey, the weight of his words hung in the air. The galaxy had been reshaped without a single shot fired. The Terrans had won, not by strength, but by rewriting the fabric of reality. And the Veil was powerless to stop it. The room felt colder, quieter, as the dreadnoughts loomed over them like giants in the dark. But the Veil wasn't finished. Not yet. Varnock Thrisk stood before the grand viewport, his eyes drawn to the immobile dreadnoughts that now dominated the stars. They had once been an unthinkable presence, a mere threat on the periphery of Veil space. But now they were the foundation of a new order, a quiet, overwhelming force reshaping everything in their path. The galactic map, once filled with vibrant sectors of control, was now eerily empty. There were no new battles to be fought, no victories to claim. The Veil was no longer a power to be reckoned with. They were an afterthought in a universe redefined by the Terrans. Behind him, the hum of the command center was softer than it had ever been. Officers no longer spoke in hurried commands. Their voices had lost their urgency, their fire, as the Veil's empire crumbled before their eyes. The realization had set in long ago, but now it was final. There was no turning back. "We've lost," Zilthark said quietly, his voice thick with a sense of finality that matched the cold emptiness around them. The fleet marshal's eyes were fixed on the display, watching as the last of the sectors blinked out of existence. Everything we fought for, everything we built, it's gone. Varnak didn't turn to face him. He didn't need to. The words were hollow, but they were true. We never fought the Terrans, he murmured. We thought we did, but we never did. His voice trailed off as he took in the sight of the dreadnoughts. Silent, immovable, their power not in their weapons but in their stillness. The galaxy, once so full of life, had been left in a vacuum, a void carved out by the Terran's quiet hand. The galaxy is not ours anymore, Varnak said softly, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his lips. We thought we controlled space, but we never controlled it. We only held on to it for as long as they allowed. Earth, his words faded, lost in the weight of the truth. Earth didn't conquer us. They erased us. Gorich Yun, who had been silent for far too long, stepped forward, his voice hoarse. How? How did they do it? We saw their power, their dreadnoughts. We knew they were dangerous, but we never imagined. His voice caught in his throat, unable to finish the thought. Varnak's eyes, dark and hard, turned to face him. They didn't need to fight us, Gorich. They didn't need to destroy us in the traditional way. They simply changed the rules. The galaxy was never a battlefield to them. It was a canvas, and they painted it in their own image. We were just, he paused, gathering his thoughts. We were just the last remnants of a dying era. Zilthark clenched his fists, his claws scraping across the metal of the table. His voice trembled, a rare crack in his hardened exterior. We fought wars, we fought battles, and now we're being erased without a single shot fired. There's no battle to win here, Varnak said, his tone distant, resigned. The Terrans didn't conquer us. They didn't destroy us. They made us irrelevant. The weight of his words fell heavily on the officers in the room. The absence of conflict was the true terror. There were no soldiers left to fight, no explosions to break the tension. There was only the quiet, creeping certainty that they had been outsmarted, outlasted, and now they were no more than a footnote in history. The room seemed to close in on Varnak, the walls pressing in as the reality of their situation settled deeper into his bones. He turned back to the viewport, unable to tear his gaze away from the dreadnoughts. They've become the architects of the galaxy, he said quietly. And we, he exhaled slowly, his voice low. We are nothing but remnants of a past age. A long pause filled the room. Silthark turned away, his eyes falling to the display in front of him. His voice was barely audible. What happens now? Varnak's jaw tightened. Now? Now we wait. We accept that our time has passed. Gorich's voice cracked, a mix of anger and disbelief rising within him. We don't just accept this. We don't let them rewrite the galaxy like this. We still have something left. We're not finished yet. Varnak's gaze sharpened, and for the first time in weeks he looked directly at his officers. You think this is a battle we can win? A war we can fight? His voice was calm, almost sorrowful. They don't need weapons. They don't need armies. They've already won. Zilthark slammed his fist onto the console, the harsh sound cutting through the thick air. Then what do we do, Varnak? What do we do when the war is over and we've lost without even knowing we were in it? Varnak's expression softened. We adapt, he said slowly, his voice carrying a grim acceptance. We live in the world the Terrans have made, and we learn from it, but we never make the same mistake again. For a moment the room was still. The tension, once palpable, had dissolved, leaving behind only the crushing weight of defeat. There was no grand battle to be fought. There would be no triumphant return, no glorious victory. The Veil had not been conquered. They had been forgotten. The galaxy is theirs now, Varnak said quietly, the words echoing in the silence. And we are the ones who will tell the stories of how it once was. But that's all we are now, a story. Zilthark looked at the screen, his eyes narrowed, reflecting the emptiness of the universe. A story, he repeated, nothing more. Varnak turned back to the display, his eyes tracing the patterns of the dreadnoughts. They had no need to fight. They had no need to declare war. They had simply remade the universe in their image, and in doing so, they had ensured that the Veil would be no more. The Terrans didn't just conquer, Varnick said softly, as if speaking to himself. They made us irrelevant,